Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening, and I appreciate the organizers inviting me to this debate. The motion that Steve and I are defending is that to best bring the Ukraine crisis, this geopolitical crisis, to an end, it's important to first start by acknowledging Russia's interests. So what we're talking about here tonight is how best to end this crisis. We're not talking about who started it, who should be blamed. We're not talking about whether Vladimir Putin is a good guy or a bad guy. The question here is how best to end it. Now, this is referred to as a geopolitical crisis in the motion. My view is that it's much more than a geopolitical crisis. This is a geopolitical disaster. First of all, look at what's happening to Ukraine. This country is in the process of being destroyed. The war is only 78 days old. If this war goes on, you can only imagine what's going to happen to Ukraine. Estimates are by the World Bank that over $60 billion worth of damage has been inflicted on Ukraine. Some people say that it will take $600 billion to rebuild the country. Thousands of people have been killed. Cities have been destroyed. 5 million people have left the country. 6 million people are internally displaced. 13 million people are living in combat zones. For the sake of the Ukrainian people, it's essential to bring this to an end. Furthermore, we run the risk here that this war, which is now between Ukraine and Russia, is going to turn into a war between Ukraine and the United States. It's going to turn into a great power war. This is a really scary thought. We know very well that when wars become long wars, they tend to escalate. And the last thing we want is a war between the United States and Russia. And the reason is because the threat of nuclear war is on the table. Now, many of you might think this is not a serious possibility, but that would be a fundamental mistake. You should understand what America's goal is in this war. America's goal is to inflict a decisive defeat on Ukraine, number one, and number two, to bring the Russian economy to its knees with economic sanctions. If you listen to General Austin, who is the Secretary of Defense, he's basically talking about knocking Russia out of the ranks of the great powers. This is another way of saying we are presenting Russia with an existential threat. Now, does that mean that they will use nuclear weapons? Nobody can say for sure, but there is a serious possibility. Avril Haines, who's the Director of National Intelligence, said on Tuesday when appearing in Capitol Hill that one of the two scenarios in which Russia will use nuclear weapons is if it is being defeated in Ukraine. Well, our basic goal is to defeat Russia in Ukraine. So we have a very perverse paradox here. The paradox is that the better the United States does on the battlefield, with the Ukrainians doing the fighting, of course, the more likely it is that Russia will turn to nuclear weapons, and we might end up in a general thermonuclear war. We have to end this war to make sure that doesn't happen. Now, the motion says that we start by taking into account Russia's interest. This does not mean that we don't consider the interests of Ukraine, the interests of the United States, the interests of NATO. Of course we take into account their interests. But we start with the Russians, and the reason we start with the Russians is very simple. They started the war. And what we have to do is figure out what their interests are, because if we don't know what their interests are, there's no way we can shut this one down. So we're starting with Russia's interests. Now the question is, what are Russia's interests? The conventional wisdom, which I'm sure all of you have heard ad nauseum, is that Vladimir Putin is responsible for this war. Vladimir Putin is an imperialist. He's either trying to create a greater Russia or he's trying to recreate the Soviet Union. And what's going on here is that Ukraine is a country that he wants to conquer and incorporate into Russia. He wants to absorb it. There is absolutely no evidence to support that argument. There is no evidence that he thinks that's desirable. There's no evidence that he thinks that's feasible, and there's no evidence in the public record that he's ever said that that's what he intends to do. This is a crisis that is all about the West's efforts to turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark on Russia's border. It involves a three-pronged strategy, bringing Ukraine into the EU, turning Ukraine into a pro-Western liberal democracy, and number three, and most importantly, bringing Ukraine into NATO. If you listen to Putin's speeches and you read his writings, he has made it unequivocally clear that this is the principal problem: Ukraine joining NATO. And what has to be done here to solve this problem is Ukraine has to become a neutral country. Ukraine cannot become a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. You may not like that outcome, and I fully understand that. But if you are interested in preventing Ukraine from being completely destroyed, and you are interested in avoiding a nuclear war, you should be in favor of the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. It is a great pleasure to be here and speaking on this important issue. The motion states, ending the world's worst geopolitical crisis in a generation starts with acknowledging Russia's security interests. It focuses our attention on security because that's the issue driving Russia's behavior, and it's that behavior we have to change to bring this tragedy to an end. John has explained why Russia saw efforts to bring Ukraine into the West as an existential threat, which led them to launch a brutal and illegal invasion. I want to drive this point home by pointing out that major powers, including democracies, often act in brutal and dangerous ways when they believe their security is at risk. Consider China in 1950. China was very weak at the time, but when U.S. forces in Korea approached their border, Mao Zedong ordered his army to cross the Yalu River and attack them. We had no intention of invading China, but Mao didn't know that, and he thought the survival of his regime was at risk. The Korean War lasted 2 more years. Thousands of additional lives were lost. We don't like to admit it, but democracies act this way too. During the 1960s, the United States was so worried that South Vietnam would become part of the communist world, it sent nearly 500,000 troops across the ocean to fight there, and 58,000 of them didn't come back. We used napalm and Agent Orange and dropped more than 6 million tons of ordnance. When that didn't work, we invaded Cambodia, which unwittingly helped the Khmer Rouge gain power. Millions of people died because American leaders believed losing South Vietnam might undermine our security. And Vietnam wasn't on our border. It was more than 8,000 miles from the continental United States. In the 1980s, a popular uprising in Nicaragua toppled a pro-American dictator, much as the Maidan uprising toppled Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. In response, we organized and armed a rebel army, the Contras, much as Russia has backed separatist movements in Ukraine. Nicaragua was a poor country whose population was only 4 million people, but the Reagan administration saw it as a serious threat. 30,000 Nicaraguans died in that war. Finally, let's not forget that the United States invaded Iraq in 2003 because the Bush administration thought Saddam Hussein was a mortal danger. That war, which Professor McFall supported and John and I opposed, killed thousands of Iraqis, did enormous damage to the country, and led to the emergence of ISIS. The Bush administration chose to launch an illegal war because it felt threatened. And just like Putin, President Bush thought the war would be easy. None of this excuses what Russia is doing today, not in the slightest. All these actions should be roundly condemned. But my point is that when powerful states think their security is threatened, they'll go to great lengths to try and deal with the danger, and they'll do great harm in the process. If they face setbacks, they're more likely to double down than reverse course. The lesson is that threatening a great power's security is a very risky business, especially in the nuclear age. Now, today, many people want to ignore the security fears that led to this war and simply punish Putin. They want to inflict a decisive defeat on his army, collapse the Russian economy, get him removed from power, and put him on trial. Those desires are completely understandable, but this approach is morally questionable and dangerous. It's questionable because prolonging the war means more Ukrainians will die and the country will suffer even more destruction. It's dangerous because the prospect of a catastrophic defeat could lead Russia to escalate, including the possible use of a nuclear weapon. And as John said, as Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines said 2 days ago to the Senate Armed Services Committee, President Putin would only authorize the use of nuclear weapons if he perceived an existential threat to the Russian state or his regime. When she was asked what he would regard as an existential threat, she said, quote, believing he might be about to lose in Ukraine. It is in everyone's interest to minimize these risks. Our goal should be to bring this war to a close as quickly as possible. We need a political settlement that both sides can live with and that neither side will want to overturn in the future. That settlement must provide security for Ukraine, but also for Russia, because, again, it was Russia's security concerns that caused the war. That's why ending this crisis must start by acknowledging Russia's security interests. Any other course of action will do more damage to Ukraine, cause additional suffering in countries that depend on Russia and Ukraine for food, 30% of the world's supply of wheat, and increase the risk of nuclear war. That's why I support the resolution.